Carnegie Hall, New York, 15 years ago. Crystal chandeliers shine down on a pair of dark hands, gliding across the keys of a Steinway with impossible speed, every note sinking into the walls as the entire hall fell silent, not out of awe, but because no one had ever witnessed a black child do something like this. That girl was Romina Carter, a piano prodigy predicted to reshape the landscape of classical music in America. The press called her the miracle from Harlem, a star rising above skin color and background. But just one summer after that radiant night, Romina vanished from the stage. No one knew where she had gone. No one heard those notes that once brought people to tears. No scandals, no accidents, no farewells, just a void in the unfinished symphony bearing her name. Years later, on a hill west of the city, inside a white stone mansion larger than a city block, a woman in a gray uniform bowed her head as she dusted the glass candle holders. She was part of the servant staff in the dull world of the Hallberg elite. Her name was Romina Carter. But here, people called her by something simpler, Romy. No one remembered where she came from. No one paid attention to the eyes that always looked down or the voice never louder than the breeze. She was a shadow in the house, moving without a sound, cleaning everything before anyone noticed the dirt. Her fingers were still agile and skilled, but they no longer danced across keys. They swept across glass window, sills grooves in the wall, and the carved handles of antique doors. She had worked there for 3 years, starting at the ground floor, and now responsible for the entire East Wing. Waking at 4:30, dressing in darkness, always arriving. An hour before her shift, Romy never complained, never arrived late. A truly invisible presence. That morning, like every other, as dew still clung to the front lawn, Romy slipped through the side gate with her staff badge and changed into the uniform that made her blend into the ivory walls of the Hallberg mansion. In the back laundry room, the housekeeper Gladys handed her the task sheet with a slight frown at seeing her already dressed. Up early again, huh? Romy smiled faintly. The East Wing has guests. I wanted to start early. Gladys looked at her eyes, holding more than just satisfaction. With a diligent worker, something that looked like understanding. She knew Romy did not speak much, but always did more than asked. That understanding was the one thing that made Romy feel she had not disappeared entirely from the world. Around 9 a.m., while Romy was cleaning the grand sitting room under soft golden lights through silk curtains, she heard piano music from the room next door. It was not from the overhead speakers, but real piano breathing, human imperfect in all the right ways. At first tentative, then confident and fluid. She froze, rag in hand, eyes fixed on the open door heart, skipping a beat. Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major, the warm-up piece she used to play for her teacher Leo. Romy's fingers twitched like they wanted to move on keys again, an old reflex buried deep in memory. The man playing was around 40, wearing a white shirt, his gestures soft and practiced. A hired pianist clearly brought in for the weekend gala. She stood a moment longer, then quietly turned away, wiping a tear before anyone could see. But not quickly enough to escape the eyes of Jacob Hallberg, the rarely seen son of the family. He stood nearby, watching her with curiosity. Beautiful, isn't it? Romy bowed her head slightly, her voice barely audible. Very beautiful, sir. She was about to leave when Jacob asked, "Do you like classical music, Miss Carter?" For the first time in 3 years, someone called her by her full name. She nodded gently. "I used to." Not much time for it now. Before Jacob could say more, the sharp click of heels broke the moment. Marissa Hallberg entered blonde waves, tight dress eyes, sharp voice dripping entitlement. Jacob, when did you get back? Then her gaze fell on Romy. That table's still dusty. Romy lowered her head. I will redo it immediately, miss. Marissa turned to Jacob, raising her voice. These uniforms are dreadful, like some cheap hotel. Maybe we should switch to something more stylish. Neither of them knew that just days from now, the very black woman holding a cleaning rag before them would leave the entire elite crowd in their hall speechless. And the same hands that once silenced Carnegie Hall would awaken again the sound that had once made the whole world stop and listen. Guests began arriving by mid-afternoon. Black luxury cars rolled past the Hallberg mansion gates, like a procession from a world that never bowed to anyone. Douglas Hallberg stood in the grand foyer navy suit, crisp silver hair, combed back with the pride of a man who always owned the spotlight. He was speaking to a group of investors about a new painting from Prague, yet his eyes kept drifting toward the grand piano in the music room, recently polished to a mirror shine. Quinn, the manager, stood beside him, nodding furiously, the kind of man who knew how to flatter without speaking too much. Romy was changing out the fresh flowers in a Ming vase in the main hall when she heard Douglas's voice carry across the space, half joking, half intentional, loud enough for everyone to hear. The new maid will perform something at the party, a little surprise act. Laughter followed, careless and cold, the kind of laughter that echoed through every afternoon tea in these circles. Romy did not turn her head. She kept arranging the flowers as if she had heard nothing, but her spine had stiffened. One man asked, "Really? She plays music." Douglas shrugged, not really important, just for fun. The evening will have a little entertainment, something like hidden talent from the staff. Marissa stepped in red lips, curling into a smile, her eyes dripping with mockery. Nice idea. Let her open the night. Then the real artist can come on stage. It will heighten the drama. Each word cut into Romy like blades dragging across memory, where a 10-year-old girl in a white dress had once stood beneath the lights of Carnegie Hall, playing for Elise. So beautifully, the entire orchestra behind her fell, silent. Same kind of crowd, same spotlight, but now they looked at her not as an artist, but as amusement in a pale gray uniform. She did not protest, did not step back. She simply said, "Just a short piece, sir." That sentence was like nodding to a sentence already passed without trial. That evening, as she washed her hands in the kitchen after her shift, Gladys stopped her. "I heard the master asked you to perform." Romy lowered her head, not wanting to answer. "You have the right to refuse," Gladys continued, her voice calm but firm. "You can say you do not play." "I know," Romy replied, eyes still fixed on the water running through her fingers. "But I also know that refusing in this world is not simple." She said it not in fear, but in the quiet tone of someone who has learned how to survive. "I will play something easy, then return to my post." Gladys paused for a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "There is something you are not telling me, isn't there?" Romy smiled, faint as morning fog. "There are many things I have not told anyone." That night, her small apartment glowed under a single yellow light bulb. She sat still on the edge of her bed, as if even moving would make time collapse. From beneath it, she pulled out an old leather-case dust, softening the cracked surface. She opened it. Inside lay faded sheet music, yellowed by time, a few ribbons bleached by sunlight, and a photo of a teenage girl sitting beside an elderly black man at an upright piano. Leonard Tucker, a jazz legend who had taught her when she was just another unnoticed child in Harlem. In the photo, his eyes burned bright like fire. Hers lifted proudly. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a small electric keyboard on the kitchen table. She powered it on, plugged in her headphones, and rested her fingers on the keys. No sound came through the room, but her body remembered. Every muscle in her fingers, every pause between shifting keys returned like they had never left. She closed her eyes and let that silent current move through her, not words, not sound, just a life searching for its way back. At that very moment, on the third floor of the Hallberg mansion, Marissa lay across her oversized bed, laughing with her friends as she spoke about the upcoming performance. She actually thinks she can play. Unbelievable. She stressed each word with a glee that only someone used to staging cruelty could carry. One friend hesitated, saying it sounded a bit harsh, but she laughed anyway. Marissa shrugged, explaining with the logic, only those used to power ever dare say aloud. No one forced her. She agreed to it. In the darkness of a quiet apartment, the woman who once brought Carnegie Hall to its feet played in silence. She could not hear. Marissa's laughter did not know she was being turned into a living joke. But deep inside, she knew that tomorrow's music would not just be a tune. It would be the line drawn between staying invisible or letting them see that her light, though dimmed, had never died. And sometimes an invitation thrown out like a mockery could become the start of a song the world had never truly heard before. In the still of night, when the Hallberg mansion had gone quiet, and only a few dim lights flickered behind thick curtains, Romy stood before the wooden door leading into the music hall. Her hand rested on the brass handle, hesitating for a moment, then gently pushed it open. Not a sound echoed. The stone floor beneath her feet was cold enough to send a chill through her bones. The grand room lay bathed in silver moonlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened to the October sky, letting in a pale shimmer like shattered dust. At the center of the room, the grand piano stood glossy and deep black like a soul asleep waiting to be awakened. Romy walked forward, each step softer than a breath. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew the spacing of the keys, the height of the bench, the distance from her heel to the pedal. There was a time when this place was the only world she belonged to. She sat down so quietly, not even a creak followed. Her hands hovered over the keys, fingers trembling, like it was the first time she touched something sacred. She didn't play Mozart or Chopin or Beethoven. She played her own music, the melodies that had lived quietly in her mind for over a decade. The sound came first muffled, then clearing into sharp light. Each note unfurled in the silence like a winter blossom, fragile yet defiant. The first few bars held fear, then loss, then years of anger buried too deep to speak, and finally a call from within, begging for another chance to live. Every key she struck was a scar. Every glide across the octaves, a memory stitched back into place. She forgot where she was, forgot that tomorrow she had mirrors to polish and trash to empty. Right now, it was only her and the music. Only her hands speaking for the silence she had swallowed too long. Behind her, a shadow stood quietly in the doorway. Jacob Hallberg. He had not yet left. After his late meeting with investors, he didn't move, didn't make a sound, as if any noise might turn the melody into smoke. His face was still like a man witnessing something he never imagined could exist in this house. When the final note lingered in the air, Romy's eyes were still closed. It wasn't until she heard a faint breath behind her that she turned. Jacob didn't hide. He stepped out of the darkness, eyes wide with honest awe. That was not just a little skill, like you said, Romy. That was the level of someone who once stood on a grand stage. She rose quickly, voice shaking. I was just checking if the piano was in tune. He shook his head. No smile, no joke, just a steady voice. Do not deny what I just heard. She fell silent, unsure how to respond. She had spent years hiding, used to being looked through like she wasn't there. Being seen now, truly seen, made her panic. She turned and walked out, disappearing down the long hall back to the staff quarters. But Jacob stayed. For a long time, his eyes still fixed on the piano that had just shaken something loose inside his chest. The next morning, he opened his laptop and typed in the name Romina Carter. Nothing showed up. He tried spelling variations, tried the phrase she once mentioned. Then finally he found a blurry old article dated 15 years ago. The headline was simple, but it sent a chill down his spine. Prodigy disappears after mother's death. The photo was grainy but clear enough. It was her, the same woman who had been wiping mirrors in his home for 3 years. The same woman his father planned to parade for entertainment at the upcoming gala. And now he understood why she had hidden. Because the way this world looked at talent like hers was not with reverence. It was to devour it, to turn it into a story for dinner tables lined with wine and applause. Back in Romy's apartment, the sheet music from the night before still lay open on the table. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were red from staying up, not out of fear of being exposed, not because of nerves before a performance, but because for the first time in so many years, the music had returned like a storm. She had played, not because anyone asked, not to impress anyone. She played for herself. And the sound that filled that dark room last night, it wasn't a joke. It was the quietest declaration she had ever made. And this time, someone had heard it. By the second Monday, after Romy played the piano in the dark, the Hallberg mansion moved with its usual rhythm, precise and elegant, like a machine greased by money and pride. But for Romy, every step on the cold stone floor now carried a strange sense of weight. As if someone had tapped on the wall she built around herself, and small cracks had begun to form just enough for the light to leak through. While she was crouched down, polishing the glass doors in the southern hall, Elliot Meyer suddenly appeared. He was no stranger to the art world, once a prominent critic for the Metropolitan Review, before transitioning into PR for major cultural institutions. He was introduced as someone writing a piece for the Hallberg Foundation's newsletter. But the way he looked at Romy was not the look of a man doing a simple press job. He walked closer, greeted her quietly, then said something that made her freeze. I heard you play at Carnegie Hall about 15 years ago. The small black girl that Rachmaninoff in G minor made the entire hall forget to breathe. Romy looked up, eyes filled with both shock and caution. He picked up the sheet she had just dropped, a photocopy of an old concert program she had printed from the public library. Handing it back, he said softly, I remember the name, Romina Carter. She responded bluntly, avoiding his gaze. That was for my niece's school project. I just printed a test. Elliot did not push, just gave a subtle nod, though the mixture of suspicion and regret was clear in his eyes. When he walked away, her heartbeat was still stumbling. The years she had tried to disappear were not enough to erase all traces. It only took one pair of the right eyes, one deep enough memory to unravel everything. And the silence she had trusted for 15 years could no longer keep its promise. Inside the office, Jacob typed fast on his laptop, the notes from that night still playing clearly in his head. He found an old article that mentioned Romina Carter, the prodigy once mentored by Leonard Tucker, vanishing after her mother's death. No scandal, no signs of breakdown, just a void. A genius who erased her own name from the stage. That night, Romy returned home earlier than usual. She opened her old suitcase and pulled out unfinished sheet music she had written at 17, back when her mother was in the hospital. Incomplete compositions, many with missing transitions, but each carried the sound of that girl from long ago, with hope and loneliness tangled in every line. She placed her fingers on the small keyboard, powered it on, and did not play Chopin or Mozart. She played her own piece, the one that had never been performed. The melody was heartbreakingly raw, a blend of classical foundation and the breathless freedom of jazz, like a vivid confession from someone who had stepped away from light and buried herself in silence just to survive. She did not know that someone was standing quietly on the first floor of the Hallberg estate, listening through a cracked open door. Jacob could not see her, but he knew. That was not music played for fun. That was truth. That was soul. That was a voice forced into silence for far too long. The next morning, in the guest lounge, Quinn Marshall called Romy over and handed her a folder filled with sheet music. "Which one will you perform at the gala?" he asked the boss. "Wants to make sure it is nothing too complex for the audience." She opened the folder, found pieces that were childishly simple, fit for beginners. She smiled faintly, closed the folder, and nodded. "I will pick from these." But Jacob saw the subtle flicker in her eyes, like a knife had brushed past. He approached her while she folded table linens and asked quietly, "Are you really going to play one of those?" Romy did not turn around. "I have not decided." Jacob tilted his head, lowering his voice even more. "If they expect a circus act, then give them something they will never forget." He was not trying to be a savior, not preaching. He was simply standing beside her. And for the first time, Romy felt she was not completely alone. That night, she rewrote the entire unfinished piece. She crossed out old lines, added harmonies she had never dared to try. A new piece was born, shaped by fracture and rebirth, steeped in classical roots, but breathing like jazz, as if she had pulled a piece of her memory from the soil. She named it Silence Reclaimed, and she knew if she chose to perform it, there would be no turning back, no more hiding, no more shadows. Only the stage, the light, and a single chance to reclaim what had been stolen from her entire life. An hour before midnight, when every room in the Hallberg mansion had gone quiet, Romy returned to the grand hall where the piano stood. No lights were turned on, only the moonlight spilled across the cold keys like a thin white veil. She sat down, her hands resting on each note as if she were touching her own skin. She brought no sheet music. Everything was engraved into her body from another life. She played the new piece she had just completed the night before, a piece no one had ever heard. It followed no classical form, no theoretical system could contain the emotions it carried. The opening melody sounded like the footsteps of a child walking through the damp alleys of Harlem, then expanded into the hollow vastness of a hospital night, cramped and cold. The middle section was filled with tight, aching harmonies, like a cry that never made it past the throat. The ending opened to a thin ray of light. Not whole, not perfect, but enough to let the listener believe there was a way forward. When the final note dissolved into the air, Romy stayed still, hands frozen in place, eyes staring into the darkness ahead. A soft sound made her turn around. A wheelchair stood by the door, and in it sat the man she thought she would never see again. His face was older than memory hair, snow white, but his eyes still held the same sharp warmth that once lit the path for a 13-year-old girl. She said nothing. She stood up, walked slowly toward him, then knelt by his side. He did not smile, did not speak in that commanding voice of the past. He simply laid his frail hand on hers and said in a voice deep and coarse with age, "You are still in there." Romy could not hold it in any longer. She cried not from pain, but from something deeper than memory. A truth buried too long had finally been called by its name. She looked at him, her lips trembling like a child. "I broke my promise to my mother. I stopped playing after she died." He squeezed her hand gently, not loud, but certain. Music never leaves anyone. It waits for us to be strong enough to return. They sat there for an hour, saying little, only trading stories from the missing years. Romy spoke of the tiny apartment, of the silent electric keyboard, of the fear of being found, of how she lived like a ghost for 15 years. Leo told her about the treatments, about the moment he watched the video Jacob had sent and recognized immediately the student he once taught. At dawn, when the first light began slipping through the cracks of the windows, Leo whispered, "Play that piece for me, again, the one you are going to perform tomorrow night." Romy sat back down, said nothing, just placed her hands on the keys. And as the sound rose once more, Leo sat still, eyes closed, lips pressed tightly, each breath falling in rhythm with the music. Outside the room, Elliot stood silently in the hallway, not stepping in. He did not want to interrupt that moment. He simply stood there, eyes unblinking, and when the music stopped, he whispered to himself in the dark, "It's her. There is no doubt now." The next morning, Douglas Halberg arrived unusually early for the gala planning meeting. As he passed through the great hall, he caught a glimpse of Leo in his wheelchair, speaking with Jacob and Elliot. Something about the atmosphere felt different, but he did not dwell on it. He still believed tomorrow night would be his stage, his charity's triumph, his well-crafted show featuring the Maid of Color, whose humble performance would make guests see him as progressive. He had no idea that in the middle of that performance, he had unknowingly opened a door to a truth far beyond his control. In a small room behind the kitchen, Romy sat alone, her fingers tracing the notes printed from the photographs Elliot had secretly taken. The original had been torn apart, thrown into the trash bin by the side entrance, where Marissa had walked past with a satisfied look. But Elliot had saved it with his camera. Romy held each sheet, smoothing the creases one by one, and knew that whatever happened tomorrow night, this would be the first time in 15 years she was no longer afraid of the light. Leo had seen her. Elliot had heard her. Jacob had believed in her, and most of all, she had heard herself. Not the voice of Romy the maid, but the echo rising again of Royna Carter, the girl who once silenced all of Carnegie Hall with just 10 fingers. She was no longer the woman who cleaned in the shadows. She was stepping onto her own stage, and this time she would not turn back. The gala unfolded on a windless night when even the shadows of the trees in the garden stood still, as if holding their breath. The Halberg mansion glowed under soft golden lights, laughter and chatter from the elite echoing through the grand hall where wine glasses clinked against crystal like a symphony of hollow congratulations. From the upper floor, the scene resembled a grand play where everyone had chosen a role, a mask, and no one dared admit they were merely acting. In a small backstage room, Romy wore a simple black dress tailored just for her. She needed no gown, no glittering jewelry. All she carried was her mother's small silver necklace and a pair of low heels that had steadied her life for years. Jacob entered and handed her the printed program. Her name was listed as Romina Carter, solo piano performance with no annotations. No mention of Prodigy, no Carnegie Hall, no titles. Just a name and a piano. She looked at Jacob, her eyes expressing quiet gratitude. He understood. She wanted to be there not because of her past, not out of pity, but for this moment. As the guests settled into their seats, the lights in the music room slowly dimmed. Douglas Halberg stepped onto the small stage and opened with a short speech about how art can arise from the most unexpected places. Beneath his seemingly generous words was a subtle boast emphasizing how sometimes we forget that within our own homes, hidden talents lie dormant. His closing line was a pat on his own back. A humanitarian who discovered a gem buried in the dirt. He did not see the way Jacob's expression turned cold behind the stage, nor did he notice the strained silence among the few guests who knew the truth. Romy stepped out. No bow, no smile, no nod. She simply walked toward the grand piano and sat down. The room fell silent. The air was tight, waiting for a shift. Those who thought she was just the maid were stunned. Those who knew who she was held their breath. And people like Douglas kept smiling calmly, thinking they were about to witness a heartwarming performance, just emotional enough to soften the crowd. But no one knew what Romy had chosen to play. Because this piece had never existed on any stage, she placed her hands on the key's shoulders, loose eyes, gently closed. No introduction, no microphone, no spotlight. The first note rang out deep and long like a voice from the bottom of a well. Then came the abrupt harmonic shifts, untraditional like a lost soul who kept walking anyway. The music didn't tell a single story. It was a series of emotional slices, waves rising and falling, sometimes as gentle as a mother's hand, sometimes sharp like buried memories breaking free. By the third minute, the room was still silent but tense like a tightened string. By the fifth, a few people began to breathe heavier. By the eighth, faces started to change. Not just because of the music, but because of the one playing it. She was no longer the maid they passed by wiping windows. No longer the pawn in Douglas's charity showcase. She was a real artist. Someone who had walked through hell and brought back a song no one else could write. Backstage, Elliot stood beside Leo, eyes red. The old man sat still, hands clasped, watching, as if memories were rising before him. As the music neared its end, there was no climax, no spectacle, just a fading line of sound thin as smoke, like the final sigh of someone long forgotten by the world. Romy lifted her hands from the piano and sat still, eyes closed. No one dared to clap immediately. Something sacred had just happened, and it needed a few more seconds to breathe. Then a single clap echoed from the left corner of the stage. Leo. He stood up from his wheelchair on trembling legs, using both hands to applaud. No words were needed. That act was the greatest recognition. A few others joined, then the entire room erupted in applause like a waterfall breaking loose. Jacob looked at Romy, pride filling his eyes. As for Douglas Halberg, he was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile that faded quickly. Because he felt something, no one spoke aloud. That performance was not for him, it was not a thank you. It was a release. And he was merely a front-row spectator to a kind of power that could not be bought. Romy stood, no bow, no tears. She turned and walked off stage, passing through a sea of stunned and emotional eyes. She needed no further praise. Everything had already been said by 10 fingers over nearly 12 silent minutes. She was back, and this time no one would make her disappear again. After the performance, the mansion seemed to split into two separate layers of atmosphere. On one side were the clinks of glasses, hollow compliments about what a spectacular evening it had been. On the other side were quiet glances, scattered whispers from those still shaken by what they had just witnessed. In a small room behind the stage, Romy sat alone, both hands resting on her knees, the imprint of sound still lingering in her fingertips, not 20 minutes after they left the keys. She said nothing, didn't smile, didn't shed a tear. She just sat there as if listening again to herself in the silence. The door creaked open. Jacob stepped in holding a glass of water, bringing no words of praise. He placed the glass beside her and sat down in the chair across from her. After a moment, he spoke, his voice soft as wind. "They no longer think you're the girl who mops the floor." Romy pressed her lips together. "I never cared what they thought I was." Jacob nodded, his eyes steady on hers. "But now they're afraid of who you are. That's the difference." Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was a quiet understanding that didn't need a name. Out in the hallway, rushed footsteps echoed. Elliot was looking for Romy. When he entered, his gaze wasn't that of a reporter. It was the look of a witness, someone who had just seen something that words couldn't quite capture. He stood before her, eyes glowing in a strange way. "I've finished the article. I'll send it to the magazine tomorrow morning. Your story deserves to be heard." Romy looked up, voice steady, slow. "If you're planning to write about a maid who surprisingly played the piano, then you should tear that piece up." Elliot paused, then smiled, not out of politeness, but recognition. "Number. I plan to write about how a buried artist made an entire room forget to breathe with nothing but her music. I plan to write about a comeback that was not a coincidence, but destiny. Because true talent doesn't die. It only quiets down, waiting for the right ears to hear it." Romy didn't argue. But she didn't seem moved either. She stared at Elliot, her eyes digging deep as if asking something else. "Are you sure the world out there is ready for someone like me?" Elliot didn't answer right away. He stepped back, voice hoarse. "Number. But if you don't step out, then who will? Who will show other black children that falling out of the spotlight doesn't mean vanishing forever?" The back door opened again. Leo sat in his wheelchair, being pushed in by an assistant. He looked at Romy, eyes carrying the light only a long-time mentor could hold. "You didn't choose the easy path, and that's why they can't look you in the eye." Romy rose and stepped toward him. For the first time since she walked away from Carnegie Hall, she held the hand of the man who once taught her how to make music, not just heard, but felt. Leo didn't ask whether she would return to the stage, didn't mention contracts or lessons. He simply spoke words that anyone listening would know meant a door had just opened. That night, after all the guests had gone, after the last wine glasses were cleared, and the lights dimmed room by room, Romy stepped into the back garden. The night air was crisp, touched with the scent of jasmine. She stood beneath the old oak tree where her mother once took her last childhood photo, holding a little wooden piano. She closed her eyes, no longer hearing applause or praise. Only the echo of her own music remained, note by note now, part of her flesh and blood, irreversible. A faint sound behind her. "Jacob." He said nothing, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes gazing toward the dim lights at the far end of the yard. After a while, he asked, his voice low, What will you do next? Romy didn't answer immediately. The wind stirred the hem of her dress. Then she spoke more to herself than to him. I won't hide anymore. Even if the light hurts, at least this time I see my face more clearly. Jacob nodded, asked nothing further. They stood beside each other in the dark, needing no promises, no declarations. Because a true journey doesn't begin with applause. It begins the moment someone decides not to stay silent anymore. And that night, in the quiet garden behind the Hallberg estate, a woman who had once lost everything stood tall, facing the coming dawn. Not as a shadow from the past, but as a survivor. And now she was ready to live under her real name. That night, it was not the music that shook the mansion to its core, but the silence that followed it, stripping every fake smile bare. When the applause burst out, then faded into murmurs in the dark. When stunned eyes were still adjusting to the image of a black woman who once scrubbed floors, now sitting tall at a grand piano, as if she had never belonged anywhere else, but the light, something else was unfolding behind the curtains. Douglas Hallberg did not step into the green room to congratulate Romy. Instead, he turned down the left hallway, entered his private study, and slammed the door so hard a painting on the wall tilted off-center. He threw the folder in his hand onto the desk, pulled out his phone, and called Marissa. His voice was not loud, but it was cold, like wind slipping through a crack in the door at midnight. You assured me she was just a cleaner. You said she no longer played. You said there would be no surprises. On the other end, Marissa, though not seeing him, felt the fury seep through like poison. I checked her background, she stammered. No performances listed in over 10 years. She never mentioned her real name. No one knew she was Rowena Carter. Douglas said nothing. He hung up, tossed his phone onto a chair, and sat down like a man realizing he had bet everything on a script he never controlled. What echoed in his mind was not the music, but the whispers out in the hall, guests murmuring to one another. Did he even know who he invited, or did he really think this was charity? The praise he thought was meant for him now felt like an insult dressed in lights. What he didn't know was that just hours before the event, Elliot had quietly approached the program director and requested a simple change in the billing. Not Rowena Carter, not cleaning staff, just Rowena Carter, an independent musician. No titles, no framing, just a name and freedom. And the director, after hearing a brief recording, nodded without hesitation. Meanwhile, in the back of the instrument room, Romy was taking off her shoes, every movement slow and deliberate, like peeling off a mask worn too long. She knew what was happening out there. She knew Douglas would never accept a truth he could not control. She knew Marissa would face the fallout and Jacob might be caught in the storm too. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She had done nothing wrong. She had only dared to be herself. Elliot stepped in without knocking, holding a printout of his completed article. He handed it to her eyes, shining with conviction. It will be in Sunday's feature. You have every right to request edits. Romy didn't take it. She looked at him, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade cutting through thin ice. Do you really think this article will change anything? Elliot nodded slowly, making no grand promises. Not the world. But maybe a few people will understand that what they thought they saw was only the surface. Hidden talents don't vanish. They just wait for the right light to return. She didn't reply, only bent down to tie her shoes. But Elliot knew in that silence was an answer. That night, after most of the guests had gone, a small group gathered in the west corridor under the soft yellow lights velvet couches. and a tea table with half-finished glasses of wine. Among them were Jacob Elliott Leo and a few who once knew Rowena Carter. They didn't talk much about the performance. They spoke of the lost years, the unanswered calls, the rumors that she had died or quit forever. A salt and pepper-haired woman whispered I once heard her play in a small hall back in 2006. She was just 16, but the music felt like it came from another world. Tonight I saw that again, and more. A man in a deep blue suit nodded quietly. True talent doesn't need permission to return. It only needs to be heard the right way. Outside, Douglas still hadn't left the study. Marissa stood in the hallway holding a folder, her eyes darting between worry and calculation. She knew a purge was coming. She knew Douglas would not take public embarrassment without action. But she also sensed something else, taking form, something stronger and more unexpected than any of his plans. Because this time he no longer controlled the story. The next morning, Elliott's article appeared on the front page of the arts section. The headline was just one line plain and unvarnished. The woman who played her own song. The piece held no flowery praise, no technical critique. Just a simple recounting of the moment a woman the world had forgotten walked onto a stage and made everything go quiet, not with power, but with truth. And that truth from now on could never be buried again. That Sunday morning, it was not just Romy who woke up in a world that had shifted. In coffee shops scattered across New York, from wealthy neighborhoods to modest street corners, the renowned art magazine featuring Elliott's article sat prominently on the stands, catching eyes with a single black and white photo taken from behind, capturing Romy's hands poised above the piano keys. No face, just a still silhouette, a simple black dress, stage lights falling gently over her unstyled hair. The headline was strangely quiet, a voice that needed no microphone. In the offices of major publishers, where editors had dismissed dozens of young artists for lacking a story worth telling, that article circulated like a bitter reminder that absence is not always an end. Sometimes it is a silent warning that they had chosen wrong. At a small Brooklyn gallery that once displayed childhood portraits of Romy beside her first piano, the gallery owner stood before one photo for a long time, then quietly took it down and replaced it with the article taped directly to the wall. No glass frame, no spotlight. Because when truth is seen rightly, it needs no embellishment. In Harlem, a group of high school students huddled inside the community library, passing the magazine like it was the next chapter of a novel they had waited a year to read. A brown-skinned girl whispered. She used to be a janitor. A boy next to her nodded. Yeah, but before that, she was a genius, and after that, she was herself. In a private music school in the Upper West Side, the homeroom teacher stood at the front of the class, laid the article on the desk, then turned to face the students. None of you have the privilege to sit here, he said. Opportunity is fragile. But talent, when it is real, no matter who tries to bury it, it rises like fire that cold air only fuels. At the Halberg estate, the atmosphere was suffocating. Douglas sat by the window, no longer commanding, no longer speaking. He stared at the newspaper in his hands, fingers trembling slightly, not with rage, but with a strange discomfort, as he realized everything he once controlled had slipped through his grasp. No one in the family spoke. They moved quietly, as if afraid a single sound might cause him to erupt. But he didn't erupt. He was silent. And that silence was the most terrifying part. Marissa walked in with an envelope, an invitation from a prestigious arts organization requesting Romy to perform at their year-end gala. They wrote that they did not know the full story, but they knew what a true artist was. Douglas didn't take the letter. He glanced at it, then gave a small nod. A nod of surrender or perhaps acceptance of a change he could no longer stop. In a small apartment in Queens, Romy stood at the kitchen counter, gently swirling a teapot. Jacob sat in a wooden chair across from her, the newspaper open before him. But his eyes were not on the print. He watched her in silence. She poured the tea into 2 cups, placing one in front of him, keeping the other in her hands. She didn't read the article. She didn't ask how others reacted. She simply said one sentence soft and sharp like a blade slicing through thin ice. They are all talking about me, but no one is asking if I am ready. Jacob put his cup down his fingers, forming a small triangle under his chin. You may not be ready, but your music already went ahead. Now all you need to do is follow it. Romy didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. An acceptance not born from pressure, but from the quiet peace of finally being seen the right way. That afternoon, her phone rang endlessly. Record labels, radio stations, even people who once cut her contracts called to invite her back. She didn't answer any of the calls, not out of pride, but because she knew not all open doors lead to freedom. A few days later, she agreed to attend a community music event in the Bronx. No grand stage, no floodlights, just a small hall with about 60 people, including kids who had never heard classical music and elders who used to play until trembling hands took that away. She sat at an old upright piano, not as pristine as the one in the Halberg mansion, but whose keys gave off a warmth that felt like home. She started with an old piece, then moved into a new melody, wordless, without introduction, as if continuing a story someone had left unfinished long ago. When the final note faded, the room was silent. Then a boy in the 3rd row raised his hand. Did you ever stop playing? Romy looked at him and smiled. I did, and I also stopped being myself. But one day I realized that even if I turned my back on music, it never left. It was always there, waiting. I just wasn't brave enough to return. The boy lowered his head. I stopped too. My friends said I played wrong. Romy stepped down from the stage, sat beside him, held his hand, and said quietly but firmly, mistakes are not the enemy. What's truly scary is believing you don't have the right to try again. And on that day, in a room with no cameras, no social media posts, no stage lights, just ears that listened and hearts that met, in truth, Romy Carter played the most beautiful piece of her life. Not for fame, not to reclaim the past, but because for the first time she was truly free. 1 month after her small performance in the Bronx, Romy received a handwritten letter, not from a producer, not from a prestigious institution, but from an unknown mother in the state of Georgia. The handwriting was slanted and shaky, the paper thin, but each word felt like it touched the bottom of the soul. She wrote about her 10-year-old daughter born in a neighborhood where no one taught music, where no one believed in art, where no one thought a little black girl could do anything beyond surviving. But the day the child saw a short video clip secretly filmed and shared by the mother's friend at the Bronx event, she kept playing the melody over and over again, crying not out of sadness, but because she said, I do not know why, but I want to touch that sound like touching something inside myself. The mother did not ask for a scholarship nor for help. She only wanted to thank Romy for remembering that music is the only language that never needs translation to be understood. Romy kept that letter in her wallet, never showed it to anyone, never posted it online, because she knew some things are sacred even when no one sees them. A few days later, she returned to the studio. Not the polished studio from her record label days, but a small place introduced by an old friend. The soundproofing was rough. No fancy equipment, just a single upright piano and a long wired microphone. But when her hands touched the keys, the sound emerged as if it had never left her for even a day. She did not record to release. She recorded to preserve something for herself. A nameless piece, no structure, just the stream of a once fractured mind slowly finding its way back to wholeness. The sound technician, after stopping the recording, said one thing: "You do not need a producer. Your music alone could move even those who do not like music." Romy smiled faintly, not from pride, but because she finally heard the words she had been waiting for all these years, not from others, but from herself. When the session ended, she packed up, thanked the small team, and walked out. No noise, no media, no turning back, because the road ahead needed no red carpet, only steady steps. Elliot sent her a printed issue of the magazine where his article about her was nominated for Best Written Feature of the Year. But she did not reply, not out of indifference, but because she had come to understand that standing out was no longer as important as showing up with meaning. At a year-end press conference for the arts, when a journalist asked Elliot about the subject of his article and whether he believed she would become a legend, he simply answered, "If I believed in legends, then she already was one. But if I believe in real people, then she is just living the most ordinary life, and that is exactly what makes her extraordinary." In the room that day were people who had once rejected Romy. They said nothing. No one apologized. No one confessed. But their eyes no longer looked at her with dismissal. They were now listening with a cautious awareness of those who realized they had passed over a diamond buried beneath the mud. At the elementary school where the little girl from Georgia studied, her music teacher played the recording. Romy had sent them a simple arrangement full of emotion. The teacher told the children, "This is not music for you to learn. This is music for you to feel, because some things do not need to be understood to be valued." Romy never returned to the grand stage. She did not sign new contracts. She did not appear on talk shows or television interviews. She went to small places no one ever invited artists to perform. She went to juvenile reform centers where children who had once given up, who had fought, who had been called numbers instead of names, sat motionless when they heard the piano notes echo through a quiet, rainy afternoon. She went to mental health hospitals where patients with memory loss could still hum back a tune after just a few minutes of listening. And she went to deaf centers, teaching music not through sound, but through vibration. These places had no ticket booths, no fancy rows of chairs, only eyes that for the first time believed that music did not care about language, skin color, or the past. At a ceremony honoring community influencers, Romy was named Artist of the Year. She did not show up to receive it. Her representative said she was at an orphanage in northern Maine, teaching children how to write melodies from the sound of rain. The host paused for a moment, then gave a gentle nod. Some honors do not need a podium because the truly deserving have chosen to stand lower so they can lift others higher. On a spring night, when the weather had not yet fully warmed, Romy returned to the old mansion not to work, but to say goodbye. She saw a few familiar faces. None of them said much. She walked down the hallway, stopped before the old piano in the living room, touched one white key, then quietly left. When the door closed behind her, people heard the wind slip through the frame like the final sigh of a past that had finally been forgiven. Her story did not end with a gold record or an international tour. It ended with a simple life where music was not a tool for fame, but a way to live truthfully. Romy Carter was no longer the name that made people gasp with surprise. It had become a name that drew silent respect, admiration, that needed no words, and a reminder that honor is not found in who cheers for us, but in how we walk through. What once tried to break us while still keeping gentleness in our eyes. She did not need to be famous. She only needed to be heard. And for the first time in many years, the world truly quieted itself to listen, not because of who she once was, but because of who she had become.